The morning Isoken left the mansion in Lagos, the sky was a bruised shade of grey, heavy with the promise of a downpour that refused to break. She moved through the silent, cavernous rooms one last time, her footsteps no longer echoing with the hollow anxiety that had defined her life for months. She carried a single, battered suitcase, the same one she had used to move their meager belongings from Benin City a decade ago. It contained no designer silks, no high-priced handbags, and none of the image upgrades Osas had forced upon her. It held only her most comfortable cotton wrappers, her notebooks, and the heavy stone mortar and pestle she had kept hidden in the back of the pantry. In her hand, she clutched the heavy brass key to the front door. She stood at the obsidian console table and looked at the divorce papers Osas had served her, still lying on the glass like a dead bird. She felt no urge to tear them, no desire to scream into the sterile air. The woman who had been satisfied with her lot was gone, replaced by a woman who was finally hungry for her own life. She placed the key on top of the legal documents, the metal clinking softly against the glass. It was a small sound, but to Isoken, it was the sound of a gate opening. She didn't leave a note. There were no words left to say to a man who saw her sacrifice as a liability. She simply turned and walked out, the heavy mahogany door clicking shut behind her with a finality that resonated in her soul. The journey away from Ikoyi felt like shedding a skin. As the taxi moved further from the manicured lawns and toward the chaotic and vibrant energy of the coast, Isoken felt the crushing weight on her chest begin to lift. She had chosen a small, wind-swept town several hours away, a place where the air smelled of salt and drying fish rather than French cologne and ambition. It was a place where people were built by the sea, steady and unpretentious, and where modern elegance was an alien concept. She arrived at a modest whitewashed cottage perched on a low cliff overlooking the Atlantic. It was small, one large room and a kitchen that opened onto a porch, but the windows were wide and the light that poured in was honest. The landlord, a weathered man with skin like crinkled leather, looked at her large frame and her solitary suitcase with a curiosity he didn't voice. He simply handed her the key and pointed toward the horizon. "The sea doesn't care about your silhouette, sister," he said with a toothless grin. Isoken stepped into the cottage and closed the door. The silence here was different. It wasn't the clinical quiet of Osas's mansion. It was a living silence, filled with the rhythmic thrum of the waves and the distant cry of gulls. She sat on the floor, opening her suitcase, and pulled out her spice jars. She lined them up on the wooden windowsill. Deep red peppers, golden turmeric, aromatic cloves, and the pungent, earthy ginger. They were her only capital, her only weapons, and the only evidence of the woman she had been before she was erased. That first night, she didn't sleep on a bed of Egyptian cotton. She spread a mat on the wooden floor, the salt spray misting through the screen door. She felt the abundance of her body against the hard wood, a physical reminder that she was still here, still solid, still real. She thought about Osas, likely at a high-end lounge with Esosa, celebrating his freedom from the weight of his past. She wondered if he knew that when he discarded her, he had discarded the only person who knew the true ingredients of his success. As the rain finally began to fall, a torrential Atlantic downpour that lashed against the cottage walls, Isoken reached for her stone mortar. She sat in the darkness and began to grind. The rhythmic thump-thump of stone against stone was a prayer. She wasn't just grinding peppers. She was grinding away the gaslighting, the shame, and the 10 years of broken promises. With every strike, she felt the lazy mind Osas had mocked sharpening into a blade of pure intent. She had nothing but her spices, her mind, and a horizon that refused to end. Osas wanted a clean break. He had it. He was now free to live in his glass world with his trophy wife, and she was free to be the mountain she had always been. As the scent of crushed ginger filled the small room, Isoken closed her eyes and smiled. She wasn't just starting over, she was returning to the source. The architect had left the building, and she had taken the blueprints with her. The transition from the high-gloss towers of Lagos to the salt-crusted edges of the coast was more than a change of scenery. It was a reclamation of the self. In the quiet of her cottage, Isoken stopped looking at her body as a project to be managed or a liability to be hidden. She began to see it as a temple that had survived a long, cold siege. She spent her mornings walking the shoreline, her feet sinking into the wet sand, her lungs filling with air that didn't taste of smog or judgment. For the first time in a decade, she wasn't breathing for two, she was breathing for one. She opened her laptop, not the shared one she had used to build Osas' career, but a modest second-hand machine she bought in the local town. With a flickering internet connection and a heart full of unspoken truths, she launched a simple blog. She didn't call it a fitness site, and she didn't use the sterile clinical language of optimal performance that Osas and Isosa worshipped. She titled it Beauty in Abundance. Her first post wasn't about weight loss, it was about the seasoning of his soul. She wrote about the spices of Benin City, the strength required to carry a family, and the lie that a woman's value is inversely proportional to her dress size. She posted a photo of her hands, stained yellow with turmeric and dusted with the red of dried chilies, holding a stone mortar. We have been told that to be successful, we must be small. We have been told that our abundance is a failure of discipline. But the earth is abundant, the sea is abundant, a mother's love is abundant. Why should we apologize for taking up space in a world we helped build? The response was a slow trickle that turned into a flood. Women from Lagos, New York, London, and Johannesburg began to comment, their words echoing a shared exhaustion. They were tired of the slay queen filters and the modern elegance that required them to starve their spirits. They found in Isoken's voice a sanctuary. As the blog grew, so did the demand for the spices she mentioned in her writing. Isoken began to package her signature blends, not in plastic sachets, but in beautiful, minimalistic glass jars with handwritten labels. She called the brand Abundance Wellness. It wasn't just food, it was a ritual. She included a small card with every jar, a seasoning for the spirit, featuring a quote about self-worth and resilience. She moved her grinding operation from the porch to a small rented warehouse in the town, hiring 2 local widows who had also been discarded by their families. Together, they worked to the rhythm of the waves, the air thick with the scent of cloves, ginger, and empowerment. Isoken didn't try to slim down for her brand. She became the brand, unapologetically plus-sized, wearing vibrant, flowing silks that moved like the ocean. She was no longer a liability to a brand. She was the brand. Her lazy mind was now navigating international shipping laws, supply chain logistics, and digital marketing. She realized that the years she spent ghostwriting Osas strategies had been her apprenticeship. She wasn't just a woman with a hobby, she was a CEO with a mission. She began to develop wellness kits that combined her spices with traditional African skincare. Oil she had used all her life, like the vanilla-scented shea butter that Osa had mocked. While Osa was busy selling a silhouette, Isoken was selling a substance. She wasn't promising a size 0, she was promising a life that tasted like something real. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sun dip into the Atlantic, she received an alert on her phone. A prominent US-based wellness magazine had shared her blog post titled The Architecture of Sacrifice. The caption read, "The most authentic voice in wellness today isn't in a gym, she's by the sea." Isoken leaned back in her wooden chair, the salt spray misting her face. She felt a deep, resonant hum of satisfaction. She was still Isoken,
satisfied with her lot, but her lot had expanded to encompass the world. She thought briefly of the glass mansion in Ikoyi, of the cold blue light of the pool, and the man who thought he could erase her by serving her a piece of paper. He had tried to prune her back to nothing, never realizing that she was a seed. And seeds, when buried in the dark, do not disappear, they grow. In the quiet of the coastal night, as the scent of her own success, ginger, earth, and victory wafted through the cottage, Isoken realized that the wellness seed had taken root. She was no longer the ground Osa walked on, she was the forest rising to meet the sky.
The honeymoon phase of Osas's new life did not end with a bang, but with the steady, rhythmic ticking of a mounting debt. In the high-ceilinged mansion of Ikoyi, the modern elegance Osas had craved was now fully realized. Yet, the house felt more like a stage set than a home. The blue light of the pool still shimmered, but the warmth that Isosa had brought to the rooms, the smell of slow-cooked spices, and the grounding weight of her presence had been replaced with a cold, sterile vacuum. Osas sat at the obsidian console table, the same place where he had once served Isosa her ending. His face was leaner now, his jawline sharper than ever, but the skin around his eyes was tight with a fatigue that no gym session could sweat away. Spread before him were not project strategies or board memos, but a stack of credit card statements and invoices that looked like a digital battlefield. Esosa, her trophy, was in the living room, illuminated by the ring light she had installed as a permanent fixture. She was wearing a designer athletic set that cost more than a junior analyst's monthly salary, her bone-straight wave flowing over her shoulders as she recorded a video for her followers. "Consistency is key, guys," she chirped into the camera, her voice a melodic, practiced hum. "To live a high-performance life, you must surround yourself with high-performance things. No excuses." Osas looked from the screen of his laptop to his wife. He remembered how he had once believed Esosa was a consultant of excellence. He had traded a mountain for a mirage, and now he was beginning to see the sand shifting beneath his feet. In the 6 months since Isosa's departure, Osas had discovered that excellence in Esosa's world was entirely performative. The domestic machinery of the house, which Isosa had managed with the invisible precision of an expert engineer, was falling apart. The chef they had hired was talented, but lacked Isosa's oversight. The pantry was often empty of essentials, but filled with expensive imported superfoods that Isosa insisted on for her videos. The laundry was handled by a service that regularly lost his shirts, and the refinement of the house was marred by the clutter of ring lights, tripods, and boxes of PR gifts that Isosa never bothered to open. But the domestic chaos was nothing compared to the financial hemorrhage. Osas looked at the statement for his primary account. There was a $15,000 charge for a brand retreat in the Maldives that Esosa claimed was essential for her visibility. There were 5-figure bills from high-end boutiques, charges for content creation teams, and a monthly subscription for a private social club that Osas was too exhausted to ever visit. "Esosa," Osas called out, his voice sounding hollow in the vast room. "Shh! I'm in the middle of a transition, Osas," she snapped, not looking away from her phone. She performed a choreographed spin, her eyes fixed on her own reflection. When she finally finished, she walked over to the kitchen island, not to check on his day, but to inspect the clean-eating salad the chef had left. She pushed it aside with a look of boredom. "This plating is tragic. I can't post this. We need to find a new chef, Osas, someone with a visual eye." "We don't need a new chef, Esosa. We need a budget."
Osas said, turning his laptop to her. Do you see these numbers? You've spent more on content production in the last 3 months than Isosa spent on our entire household in 3 years. Isosa didn't flinch. She picked up a piece of organic kale, inspecting it with clinical detachment. Isosa lived a small life, Osas. That's why you left her, remember? You told me you wanted a partner who matched your trajectory. My trajectory requires a certain level of investment. You are a partner at a top firm. Don't start acting like a man who counts coins. I am a man who manages assets, Osas retorted, his voice rising. And currently, you are a depreciating one. You promised to consult for my firm to bring in high net worth wellness clients. Where are they? All I see are teenagers liking your photos and invoices for handbags. Estosa sighed, a sound of profound aesthetic annoyance. I am building a brand, Osas. Influence is the new currency. If I look successful, you look successful. That's the partnership. If you wanted a bookkeeper, you should have stayed with the woman who smelled like peppers. She walked away, her stilettos clicking sharply on the marble, leaving him in the silence of his own making. Osas felt a cold, sharp pang of realization. Isosa had been his architect. She had ghostwritten his genius, managed his ego, and provided the mother wealth that fueled his rise. Isosa was merely a mirror. She reflected his vanity, but she added nothing to the foundation. She did not know how to strategize a merger or manage a staff. She only knew how to curate a silhouette. Later that night, Osas stood by the blue-lit pool. He thought about the anniversary he had missed, the Bini delicacies he called unrefined, and the lazy mind he had accused Isosa of possessing. He realized now that Isosa's mind was the most disciplined thing he had ever known. She had run a business, a home, and a husband's career simultaneously, and she had done it without a single ring light or a moment of complaint. He felt a sudden, desperate urge to hear her voice, to smell the earthy, honest scent of ginger and turmeric. He reached for his phone, his thumb hovering over her contact, but he stopped. What would he say? That he was drowning in the modern elegance he had demanded? That his trophy was hollow? He looked back at the mansion. The glass, the marble, the sharp angles. It was beautiful, but it was empty. He had trimmed the fat, but he had also cut the cord to his own success. The trophy wife was a masterpiece of surfaces, and Osas was beginning to realize that surfaces cannot hold the weight of a life. As the hum of the air conditioner vibrated through his bones, Osas felt a strange, terrifying sensation. For the first time in his life, he felt thin. Not the athletic elite thinness he had chased, but a thinness of spirit, a fragility that suggested that if the wind blew too hard, he might simply shatter.
In the quiet wood-paneled study of Dr. Kelvin Igbaniedon, Kelvin sat before a screen that usually displayed fluctuating market indices and geopolitical risk assessments. A man of old money and new age vision, Kelvin had spent decades identifying value where others saw only overhead. He was a billionaire not by chance, but by his ability to see the soul of a venture before the world saw the profit. That evening, he wasn't reading a prospectus. He was captivated by a blog post titled The Architecture of Sacrifice, shared by a wellness curator in his network. He leaned back in his leather chair, the dim light of the study catching the thin gold band on his pinky. His eyes, seasoned by years of high-stakes negotiations, moved slowly across Isoken's words. He had seen thousands of wellness brands, sterile, minimalistic, and designed to make the consumer feel inadequate. But this voice was different. It didn't sound like a sales pitch. It sounded like a revolution. A mind that is lazy does not build a ladder for another to climb.
A mind that is unrefined does not understand the chemistry of survival. We are not too big for success. Our success is too big for small men. Kelvin paused, struck by the raw intellectual power behind the prose. He began to scroll through Isoken's other articles. He saw photos of the coastal warehouse, the stone mortar, and the vibrant flowing silks she wore. He saw her, Isoken. She was not the curated, surgically altered silhouette the corporate world currently worshipped. She was abundant. She had the deep, ebony skin of the Edo heartland and a figure that radiated a grounded maternal authority. To Kelvin, she didn't look like someone who had let herself go. She looked like a woman who had finally arrived. He saw the intelligence in her market-first logic, recognizing the same brilliance that had once made Osas a rising star. But Kelvin was a master of patterns. He noticed the dates of her posts and the timeline of her emergence. He realized that this woman had been the silent engine of a different life, and now she was building her own. Abundance wellness, he whispered, tasting the words. He admired the branding, the glass jars, the handwritten notes, and the rejection of this slay queen aesthetic in favor of something ancient and honest. It was a $1 billion gap in a $1 trillion market. People were starving for authenticity, and this woman was serving it with ginger and turmeric. He picked up his phone and dialed his chief of staff. I need you to find a woman named Isoken. She's operating out of a coastal town in the south. I don't want a standard investment meeting. I want to see the warehouse. I want to taste the spices. And I want to meet the architect who decided she was finally done being invisible. As he hung up, he looked back at Isoken's photo. He saw the smiling eyes that crinkled at the corners, a sign of a woman who had been through the fire and come out with her warmth intact. Osas had looked at this woman and seen a liability. Kelvin looked at her and saw a masterpiece. He saw a partner who understood that real power wasn't found in a size 0 waistline, but in the ability to nourish a soul. He felt a rare flicker of excitement. In a world of filtered mirages and modern elegance that was as thin as a sheet of glass, he had found a mountain. And Kelvin Igbaniedon knew that if you want to see the horizon, you don't stand in front of a mirror, you climb the mountain. While miles away Osas was counting his debts in a cold Ikoyi mansion, Kelvin was already calculating the height of the empire he could build with a woman of Isoken's substance. He wasn't looking for a trophy to display, he was looking for a partner to conquer with. And as he closed his laptop, he knew that the wellness seed Isoken had planted was about to be watered by a rain of gold. The discovery was made. The billionaire had seen the light, and it wasn't the blue light of a pool. It was the golden, earthy glow of a woman who was no longer satisfied with her lot because she had finally realized she owned the whole field.
The dusty coastal road was unaccustomed to the sight of a convoy of black SUVs, their polished surfaces reflecting the Atlantic sun like armor. When the lead vehicle stopped in front of the small, salt-weathered warehouse, a silence fell over the town. Dr. Kelvin Igbinedion stepped out, not with the hurried arrogance of a man whose time was money, but with the measured stillness of a king visiting a long-lost province. He wore a simple navy blue linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal a sturdy forearm, and he looked at the modest sign, Abundance Wellness, with a faint, appreciative smile. Inside, the air was a thick, intoxicating tapestry of scent, the bite of ginger, the warmth of cloves, and the heavy floral sweetness of high-grade shea butter. Isoken stood at a long wooden table, her hair wrapped in a vibrant indigo scarf, her hands moving with rhythmic precision as she inspected a batch of labels. When she looked up and saw the man standing in the doorway, she didn't shrink. She didn't wipe the turmeric dust from her apron or apologize for the heat of the room. She stood tall, her mother wealth silhouette casting a long, steady shadow. Dr. Kelvin Igbinedion,
Isoken said, her voice calm and deep vibration. I didn't expect a billionaire to have such an interest in spices. I have an interest in truth, Isoken, Kelvin replied, walking closer. He reached out and picked up a jar of the signature spice blend, feeling the weight of the glass. The world is full of people selling less fat, less sugar, less life. You are the only one selling more. I've read your strategies, I've seen your growth. You aren't just selling seasoning, you're selling a reclamation of the self. They sat on simple wooden chairs in the corner of the warehouse, the roar of the sea providing the backdrop to a conversation that would change the trajectory of the global wellness industry. Kelvin didn't talk down to her. He didn't offer her a handout. He talked to her as a peer, his intelligence meeting hers in a dance of strategy and vision. Your brand is a masterpiece, but it's a localized one, Kelvin said, his eyes fixed on hers with a piercing respect. The US market is starving for this. The European high society is tired of the clinical. They want substance. They want the abundance you represent. I want to build a bridge from this warehouse to the shelves of Harrods and the boutiques of Beverly Hills. Isoken leaned forward, her lazy mind already calculating the logistical hurdles of such an expansion. A bridge like that requires more than just capital, Dr. Kelvin. It requires an understanding of the heritage behind the jar. I will not have my culture trimmed to fit a Western silhouette. Kelvin laughed, a rich, genuine sound. That is exactly why I'm here. Most men would want to package you into a size 2 box. I want to build a stadium around you exactly as you are. I want the world to see the woman who refused to be small. The partnership was sealed not with the frantic desperation of Osas's corporate deals, but with a handshake that felt like a covenant. Kelvin invested not just millions, but the full weight of his global infrastructure. Within months, the power partnership was the talk of the international business journals. Isoken's face, unapologetic, radiant, and plus size, began to appear on billboards from Times Square to the Champs-Élysées. She became a global icon of the new wellness, a movement that rejected the starvation diet culture Osas and Esosa lived by. Under Kelvin's guidance, Isoken didn't change, she expanded. She was the architect now, but she was no longer ghostwriting. Her name was on the building, and her vision was the blueprint. As they walked together, traveling to New York and London, Isoken noticed the way Kelvin looked at her. It wasn't the clinical, assessing gaze of a husband looking for a flaw. It was the look of a man who saw a mountain and felt honored to stand at its base. He valued her mind, he respected her pace, and he found her abundance to be the most beautiful thing he had ever encountered. You look different in this light, Isoken, Kelvin said one evening as they stood on a balcony overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Isoken looked out at the glittering city, her silk bubu fluttering in the wind. She thought of the one-room apartment in the Wind City and the glass cage in Ikoyi. She thought of Osas, who had called her a liability. She realized then that Osas had been right about one thing. She wasn't on his level. She was miles above it, standing on a peak he was too small to ever climb. With Kelvin by her side, the silent architect had found her voice, and that voice was currently shaking the foundations of an entire industry. The abundance of grace was no longer a coastal secret. It was a global empire.
The descent into a fraudulent life began not with a grand criminal gesture, but with the frantic, sweat-slicked desperation of a man who realized his modern elegance was a hungry beast that could no longer be fed. Osas sat in his high back leather chair at the firm, the midnight silence of the office pressing against his temples. In front of him, the cold blue light of his triple monitor setup illuminated a truth he had spent months trying to bury.
The trophy lifestyle he had curated with Esosa was a black hole, and it was currently swallowing his sanity. Esosa's demands had transitioned from expensive to astronomical. Her brand evolution required a $40,000 monthly retainer for a Los Angeles-based PR firm, a fleet of high-end vehicles for her content crew, and a constant stream of unboxing luxuries that Osas had to finance to maintain the illusion of their power couple status. When he had tried to suggest a strategic retreat from their spending, Esosa had looked at him with a chilling aesthetic detachment. I am a brand, Osas. If the brand looks cheap, the brand dies. And if the brand dies, what exactly am I doing in this house with a man who can't even afford a billboard? The fear of being small again, of being the boy from the bypass who failed to stay at the top, pushed Osas over the edge. He opened the firm's internal project ledger. For years, he had watched how the big men moved money, how they hid consultancy fees in the margins of infrastructure budgets. He had the blueprints. Isoken had taught him how to see the invisible threads of the economy, but he was now using that sight to weave a noose. His first adjustment was small, a $10,000 reallocation from a dormant site maintenance fund into a shell company he had registered under a distant cousin's name. His heart hammered against his ribs as he clicked confirm, the sound of the mouse button echoing like a gunshot in the empty office. He waited for an alarm, for a call from the compliance department, for the sky to fall, but the screen simply refreshed. The money was gone. It's temporary, he whispered to the shadows, just to cover the jewelry insurance. I'll replace it when the quarterly bonus hits. But the bonus was already spoken for, and Esosa's appetite only grew. The skimming became a routine. Every week, Osas would sit in the dark, moving numbers like chess pieces, stealing from the very company that had given him his big break. He began to live in a high-functioning paranoia. Every time the CEO walked past his office, Osas felt a cold spike of adrenaline. Every time a junior auditor asked for a clarification on a line item, he had to use all the refinement he had practiced to keep his voice from trembling. The physical toll was devastating. The elite silhouette he had worked hard to sculpt began to wither. He was thin now, but it was a gaunt, sickly thinness. His eyes were perpetually bloodshot, his designer stubble often turning into an unkempt beard of neglect. He spent more time at the office not to work, but to monitor the accounts, terrified that a stray decimal point would reveal the hollow core of his life. At home, the power couple was a mirage for the cameras. As soon as the ring lights were turned off, the house became a battlefield of silence. Esosa lived in her own digital world. Her long, bone-straight hair and slim frame were a constant reminder of the price Osas was paying to keep her. She didn't ask where the money was coming from. She didn't notice the way his hands shook when he poured his alkaline water. She only noticed when a payment was delayed. The jeweler called Osas. The payment for the custom e-pendant didn't go through, she said one morning, her voice flat and unimpressed. I'm handling it, Esosa. Everything is being handled, Osas shouted, his voice cracking. She merely raised an eyebrow, checking her reflection in the obsidian console table. Handle it faster. I have a live stream tonight with the New York wellness crowd. I can't be seen in last season's accessories. It's bad for the silhouette. Osas looked at her, the woman he had chosen over Isoken's abundance, and felt a profound, sickening regret. He was risking his career, his freedom, and his name to buy trinkets for a woman who wouldn't even look at him if he wasn't holding a credit card. He thought of Isoken's ices, her honest sweat, and the way she used to look at him even when they had nothing. He realized now that Isoke had been his moral anchor, the one who made him feel substantial. Without her, he was just a fraudulent shell, a man who had trimmed away his heart to fit into a suit he was now too small to fill. The fraudulent life was a house of glass, and the cracks were beginning to spiderweb across the ceiling. Osas knew that the audit was coming. The firm's annual review was only weeks away, but he couldn't stop. He was trapped in a cycle of theft and vanity, a modern elegance that was built on stolen bricks. As he initiated another transfer, moving $50,000 into the void, Osas felt a sudden crushing weight on his chest. He had wanted to be a billionaire, a man of status and power. Instead, he had become a thief in a silk tie, waiting for the world to realize that the man on the top floor was just a ghost hiding in the shadows.
The London sky was a crisp twilight blue, a sharp contrast to the golden warmth radiating from the historic Mayfair ballroom. This was the night of the Abundant Global Launch, an event that had set the international wellness community abuzz for weeks. Outside, the cobblestone streets were lined with black town cars, and the flashbulbs of the paparazzi created a rhythmic lightning storm against the velvet ropes. Inside, the air was a sophisticated blend of expensive floral arrangements and the subtle, earthy top notes of Isoken's signature coastal spice. Isoken stood behind the heavy velvet curtains of the stage, her heart beating with the steady, powerful rhythm of a woman who had finally claimed her own territory. She wasn't the trembling wife waiting for a husband's approval, nor was she the ghostwriter hiding in the shadows of an Ikoyi mansion. She was the architect. As the master of ceremonies announced her name, the curtains parted and Isoken stepped into the spotlight. A collective gasp, followed by a roar of applause, filled the room. She was breathtaking. She wore a bespoke gown of heavy molten gold silk that flowed over her curves like a river of light. The dress didn't try to slim her, it celebrated her. It featured structured Edo-inspired embroidery across the bodice, a nod to her heritage that Osas had called unrefined. Her ebony skin glowed with a health that came from peace, not deprivation. She was plus-sized, radiant, and carried a presence so massive it seemed to pull the very air toward her. For too long, we have been told that we are only worthy when we are less. Isoken began, her voice amplified by the silent, rapt attention of the London elite. We have been told to shrink, to hide, and to apologize for the space we occupy. But tonight, we celebrate abundance. We celebrate the seasoning of the soul and the strength of the body that has survived the struggle. Among the crowd, standing near the back with a quiet, possessive pride, was Dr. Kelvin. He watched her not as a trophy he had bought, but as a partner he had been wise enough to follow. He saw the way the most influential people in the room, women in size 0 designer dresses and men with billion-dollar portfolios, looked at Isoken. They didn't look at her with pity or the clinical assessment Osas had once used. They looked at her with hunger. They wanted the confidence she wore. They wanted the abundance she embodied. Isoken moved through the room after her speech with a grace that was both fluid and formidable. She spoke of her spice blends, her organic oils, and her mission to redefine wellness as a state of fullness rather than emptiness. She charmed the editors of Vogue and the CEOs of global retailers, her intelligence sharp and her humor grounded in the reality of her journey. Every time someone complimented her appearance, Isoken didn't deflect or self-deprecate. She smiled, her eyes crinkling with that genuine mother wealth warmth, and replied, "Thank you. This body has done a lot of work to get me here. It deserves to look this good." While she was being toasted with champagne and hailed as the new face of global wellness, thousands of miles away, Osas was staring at a screen in the dark. He had found the live stream of the gala on a high society blog.
he sat in his silent Ikoyi mansion, now a cold monument to his failures, and watched the woman he had discarded. He saw the molten gold silk, the radiant smile, and the way the world was bowing to the woman he called a liability. He saw her standing next to Dr. Kelvin, their heads leaned together in a gesture of intellectual and emotional intimacy that Osas had never truly offered her. He saw that Isoken hadn't changed her size, she had changed her world. She had found a man who was big enough to stand beside a mountain, while Osas realized he had always been too small for her shadow. The transformation was complete, but it wasn't the one Osas had demanded. It was a transformation of the spirit. Isoken had stepped out of the modern elegance cage into a global empire. She was high fashion, high status, and high impact, yet she still smelled of the coastal salt and the Bini spices. She was still Isoken, but she was no longer satisfied with the lot a small man had given her. She had taken the whole world instead. As the gala reached its peak and the music swelled, Isoken caught Kelvin's eye across the ballroom. He raised a glass at her, a silent acknowledgement of her victory. In that moment, Isoken realized that abundance wasn't just about what you had, it was about the freedom to be all that you were. She was a plus-sized queen in a golden dress, and for the first time in her life, she didn't just feel like she belonged in the room, she felt like the room belonged to her.
The morning of the reckoning did not arrive with this storm, but with a quiet, terrifying precision of 4 men in charcoal suits standing in the lobby of the firm. Osas saw them through the glass walls of his office, the Internal Audit Task Force. His heart, already thinned by months of paranoia, gave a sickening lurch against his ribs. He tried to reach for his mouse, to delete one last file, to scrub one last digital footprint, but his fingers were numb, frozen like lead. The door to his office opened without a knock. The senior partner, a man who once praised Osas as a rare gift to the industry, stood there with a face as cold as the marble in Osas's foyer. Behind him, the auditors carried laptops and black binders, the ledgers of Osas's fraudulent life. Osasumwen, the partner said, the use of his full name sounding like a death sentence. Compliance flagged the miscellaneous transfers to the shell companies. We've been watching the accounts for 3 weeks. Your access has been revoked. Security is waiting to escort you out. The modern elegance Osas had killed for evaporated in an instant. As he was led through the open-plan office, the colleagues who had once envied his sharp silhouette and trophy wife now turned their heads away. The silence was absolute, a vacuum where his reputation used to be. The handcuffs felt impossibly heavy on his thin wrists, the cold steel a final mocking accessory to his tailored suit. By afternoon, the news had hit the blogs. The power partner was a common thief. But the true betrayal, the one that drew the final drop of blood, came from within his own glass house. Isoke had once been the woman who would have sold her last wrapper to bail him out of a jail cell. Esosa, however, was a brand, and a brand does not associate with a sinking ship. Before Osas had even been processed at the station, Esosa had already contacted the authorities. She didn't wait to be summoned, she volunteered. In a sterile interrogation room under the harsh hum of fluorescent lights, Osas watched a video of his wife's deposition. Esosa sat before the investigators, looking motherlesque and tragic in a black designer dress, her 30-inch weave perfectly styled. She held a silk handkerchief to her eyes, though no tears fell. "I had no idea," Esosa's voice rang out on the recording, melodious and rehearsed. "I used his wellness brand to launder money because he was obsessed with an image he couldn't afford. I noticed the discrepancies and tried to ask questions, but he became aggressive. I only stayed to gather evidence for the firm. My brand stands for integrity. I cannot allow his small-minded crimes to tarnish the community I have built."
Osas stared at the screen, a hollow laugh rattling in his chest. He saw her for exactly what she was, a mirror that only reflected what was profitable. She had spent the money, demanded the jewelry, and fueled the vanity, but she was the first to turn the knife to ensure her silhouette remained untarnished by his scandal. She wasn't saving him, she was trimming the fat. "She's lying," Osas whispered to the empty room, but the words were thin and weightless. He had no notebooks to prove his innocence, no ghost-written strategies to save his name. He had discarded the only woman who would have died for him and replaced her with a predator who had just served him to the wolves to save her Instagram following. By evening, Isosa had posted a statement of healing on her social media, announcing her legal separation from Osas and her commitment to moving forward with light. She blocked his number before he could even make his one phone call. Osas sat on the hard bench of the holding cell, looking at the cracks in the wall. The modern elegance was gone. The partner was gone. The trophy had vanished into the digital ether. He thought of Isoken's coastal cottage, the smell of the sea, and the honest weight of her stone mortar. He realized then that he had traded a mountain of loyalty for a handful of salt, and now the salt was being rubbed into his wounds by the very woman he had called excellence. The audit had found the missing money, but Osas realized with a soul-crushing clarity that he was bankrupt before the first dollar was stolen. He had spent 10 years building a man, only to realize he had built a cage, and the only person with the key was currently in London being celebrated by billionaires while he sat in the dark, finally, truly alone.
The Lagos heat had a different flavor now. It no longer smelled of ambition and French cologne, but of exhaust fumes and the metallic tang of desperation. Osas stood at the perimeter of the Echo Hotel's convention center, his shadow cast long and jagged by the brilliant floodlights of the Abundance Global Homecoming Gala. He was a ghost in a city that usually forgets the fallen before they even hit the ground. His once sculpted physique was now a gaunt, skeletal frame, his designer suit replaced by a cheap, off-the-rack jacket that hung limp on his shoulders. He was out on parole, his bank account frozen, his name a cautionary tale whispered in the same boardrooms he once thought he owned. He watched from behind the security barriers as the elite of Nigeria, the same men and women who had once toasted to his executive silhouette, stepped out of armored SUVs. They were all there for her. Isoken, the woman he had called a liability, was now the centerpiece of the nation's economic pride. When the lead car arrived, the atmosphere shifted, the very molecules of the air seeming to vibrate with a new frequency. Isoken stepped out, and for a moment Osas forgot to breathe. She was wearing a structured kaftan of deep indigo and silver, her presence so commanding that the camera seemed to autofocus on her naturally. She didn't look like a woman who had refined herself. She looked like a woman who had expanded until she filled the horizon. Beside her stood Dr. Kelvin, his hand resting protectively, respectfully on the small of her back. They moved with the synchronized grace of true partners, a mountain and its sky. Osas felt a sickening surge of envy and regret that nearly brought him to his knees. He moved toward the VIP gate, his heart hammering against ribs that were now too prominent. He was stopped by a security guard, a young man with a chest like a barrel, who looked at Osas's frayed collar with immediate suspicion. "Invitation, sir?" the guard asked, his voice a flat professional wall. I don't have an invitation. I'm an old associate of the CEO, Osas stammered, his curated baritone now a thin, desperate rasp. "Just tell her Osas is here. Osas Sunwe. She will know me." The guard didn't even blink. "No invitation, no entry. Move along, my friend. You are blocking the flow." "Please," Osas whispered, his pride finally disintegrating into the humid night. "I just need a minute. I'm looking for a way back.
I know the business. I know the strategies. I can help with the administrative side. Just tell her I'm looking for work." At that moment, the crowd parted as Isoken paused to greet a group of journalists near the gate. She turned her head, her smiling eyes catching the light. For a split second, her gaze swept over the barrier and landed on the thin, broken man in the cheap jacket. Osas froze. He expected to see anger or perhaps the same aesthetic disgust that he once projected onto her. But as Isoken looked at him, he saw something far more devastating. Neutral, quiet recognition. She didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. She looked at him with the same clinical detachment one might use to look at a piece of furniture from a house they had long since moved out of. "Isoken," Osas called out, his voice cracking, a beggar's plea reaching over the heads of the elite. "Isoken, it's me. I've been following the brand. The US expansion was brilliant. I have some ideas for the logistics in the northern region. I just need an opening, a junior role, anything." The journalists turned, their cameras swiveling toward the ragged man at the gate. Isoken didn't look away, but she didn't step closer either. She turned to Kelvin, whispered something to his ear, and then walked toward the barrier. The security guard stepped back, his posture straightening in the presence of the queen. "Isoken," Isoken said, her voice a calm, deep vibration that carried over the noise of the city. She didn't use the name Osasunwe. That name belonged to a man who no longer existed. "Isoken, please," Osas said, his hands gripping the metal railing. "I lost everything. A saucer took the last of the offshore accounts and fled to Dubai. I have nothing left but the mind you always said was sharp. Give me a chance to work for the brand. I can be the architect again." Isoken looked at his hands, the hands that had served her divorce papers on a glass table. She looked at his face, searchingly, looking for a trace of the boy from the bypass. "The architect has already finished the building, Osas, and the mind you are offering me is the one that thought I was a liability. You didn't lose everything because of a bad investment or a slim-desk friend. You lost everything because you thought loyalty was a weight you could trim away to run faster." "I can change," Osas sobbed, oblivious to the flashbulbs. "I've learned. I see you now, Isoken. You are beautiful. You are the most elegant woman in this city." Isoken smiled, but it was a smile of profound, final closure. "I was always beautiful, Osas. You just weren't big enough to see the whole picture. I don't have a role for you, not because I am angry, but because your shared frequency doesn't exist here. We are no longer on the same level, just like you wanted." She turned back toward the gala, her indigo silk shimmering like the deep ocean. "Wait," Osas cried out, his voice a pathetic wail. "What am I supposed to do?" Isoken paused, looking back over her shoulder one last time. "Do what I did, Osas. Find a stone and a mortar. Start from the ground, and this time try to build something that doesn't require you to erase the person standing beside you." She walked away, her arms slipping back into Kelvin's as they entered the hotel, the glass doors closing with a silent, expensive hiss. Osas stood at the gate, the beggar at the gate, watching the woman he had discarded walk into a world that would never have a place for him. He looked down at his cheap jacket and his thin, shaking hands. The modern elegance was gone, and the abundance had moved on. He was finally light, just like he had always wanted. So light that he felt he might simply blow away into the Lagos night, leaving no trace at all.
The golden light of the hotel lobby spilled out onto the pavement, but it could not reach the cold shadow where Osas stood. He remained paralyzed at the barrier, his fingers still curled around the metal railing, watching the retreating backs of the woman he had discarded and the man who had claimed her worth. The gala's music drifted out, a triumphant orchestral swell that mocked the hollow whistling of the wind in his ears. Isoken stopped just before the grand mahogany doors. She murmured a word to Dr. Kelvin, who nodded with a grave, quiet respect, and then they both turned.
They didn't walk back to the gate like people looking for a confrontation. They moved with the slow, inevitable gravity of justice. As they reached the barrier, the security guard stepped aside, creating a path for the Abundance Empire. Up close, Isoken was even more formidable. The deep indigo of her silk was embroidered with silver threads that caught every glint of light, making her look like a constellation brought to earth. Beside her, Dr. Kelvin stood like a pillar of weathered stone, unmoving, observant, and possessed of a wealth that didn't need to shout. Osas tried to straighten his cheap jacket. He tried to summon a ghost of the executive silhouette he had once perfected, but his knees trembled. "Isoken," he whispered, his eyes darting at Kelvin with a mixture of terror and pleading. "Sir, if you could just hear me out. I was the one who developed the market-first logic she uses. I know the foundation of this brand better than anyone." Dr. Kelvin looked at Osas, his expression one of clinical, almost scientific interest. He didn't look at Osas as a rival. He looked at him as a specimen of a dying breed. When he spoke, his baritone was like a low roll of thunder. "I've read the original notebooks, Mr. Osasumen. I've seen the longhand script and the marginalia. I know exactly who the architect was. And I've always found it curious that a man would think he could own the building while setting fire to the person who drew the plans." Osas flinched, the words cutting through his fragile ego. He turned his desperate gaze back to Isoken. "I was confused, Isoken. Lagos, the pressure, Esosa, they got into my head. I thought I needed to be a certain way to keep the partnership. I thought I was doing it for us." Isoken let out a soft, weary sigh. It wasn't the sigh of someone who was angry. It was the sigh of someone who had finished a very long, very difficult book. She reached out and rested her hand on Kelvin, a gesture of such natural, profound intimacy that Osas felt a physical pain in his chest. "You didn't do it for us, Osas," Isoken said, her voice a calm, deep vibration. "You did it for a mirror. You wanted a life that was light enough to carry without effort. You wanted a wife who was thin enough to be a trophy, a career that was sharp enough to cut others, and a world that was as clear and cold as glass." She stepped a fraction closer, her mother wealth presence filling the space between them. "You spent years telling me I was taking up too much space. You told me my abundance was a sign of a lazy mind. You wanted everything to be lean, Osas. You wanted a slim life." She paused, her eyes sweeping over his gaunt face, his skeletal frame, and the cheap, thin fabric of his jacket. She looked at the empty SUV that had brought no one to meet him, and the frozen bank accounts that offered him no warmth. "Well, look at you now," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "Your silhouette is finally sharp. Your world is finally lean. There is no heavy food in your kitchen, no unrefined spices in your air, and no woman of substance to drag you down. I hope you enjoy it, Osas. I hope you enjoy how thin your world has become." Osas opened his mouth to beg, to offer one last strategy, one last market-first lie, but no sound came out. He realized with a soul-crushing finality that he was looking at the only woman who had ever truly seen him, and she no longer saw anything at all. He wasn't a villain to her, he was a ghost. "Come, Isoken," Dr. Kelvin said gently, his hand guiding her back toward the light. They turned away for the final time. As the glass doors of the hotel hissed shut, sealing them back into the world of abundance, Osas felt the Lagos night close in around him. He stood alone in the humidity, a thin man in a thin world, finally realizing that when he trimmed the fat from his life, he had accidentally cut the only thing that was real. He looked at his hands, the hands that had once held a diamond ring, now holding only the cold metal of a security gate. He wanted to be a billionaire, a man of modern elegance and elite status. Instead, he was a hollow shell, a silhouette of regret standing in the dark, watching the woman he had called a liability lead the world into the light. The final answer had been delivered, and as the Gala's music reached its crescendo inside, Osas finally understood that the most expensive thing in the world isn't silk or gold, it's the loyalty of a woman who was satisfied with her lot until she realized she was worth the world.
They say that success doesn't change a man. It simply pulls back the curtain on who he has been all along. Osas thought he was upgrading his life when he traded a woman of substance for a woman of surfaces. He mistook Isoken's soft curves for a lack of discipline, never realizing that her abundance was the very foundation he stood upon. He wanted a world that was thin, sharp, and cold, and in the end, that is exactly what he got. A world so thin, it had no room for loyalty. A world so cold, it couldn't hold his heart when it finally broke. The lesson here is simple, yet most men learn it too late. Never trade a mountain for a mirage. Never discard the woman who ironed your cheap shirts in a one-room apartment for the one who only wants to be seen in your mansion. Because when the lights go out and the cameras stop clicking, a trophy won't help you rebuild. Only an architect can do that. Isoken didn't become a billionaire because she changed her size. She became a queen because she finally realized she was worth the whole kingdom. She didn't need to be smaller to fit into his world. He just needed to be bigger to handle her light. Build your life on character, not on silhouettes, because beauty may catch the eye, but only substance can sustain a soul. And in this world of glass and mirrors, the only thing more expensive than success is the regret of the man who realized he traded a diamond for a piece of salt.